Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Introduction to Web Development. Now in this video we are going to be talking about the other half of inputs, which will mostly be focused on the JavaScript and actually getting it so that when the user types in something, maybe we can actually set some text or maybe we can just print something to the console. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and quick disclaimer, I do have, since I'm recording during the day, I do have some birds in the background. So hope that doesn't annoy you too much. But so we're going to go ahead and open up the index.html and hit the go live button. Now, once we are in here, as you can see, this is the kind of website that we left off on the previous episode. So I'm going to enlarge this a little bit, and then we're going to go into the console. It's a bit smaller. And notice, like, remember when I edit the text and then I click off, it types in change. And if we take a look at our script.js that we created in the previous episode, we can see we did something called document.getElement ById text-input dot onchange is equal to a function. And if specifically if this part looks a little bit confusing to you, if you've just watched this tutorial series, I recommend you check out the episode on functions in my previous series, JavaScript for Beginners. But if this part doesn't make sense, I'll be explaining this. So as I said in the previous episode, document kind of stands for the website. The document is like the biggest, is like the most, it is like the website itself. It's the whole thing. And then we are saying document dot, and then we want to get an element by its ID. And if you remember, elements are these tags, like these full tags here, like we call these p tags. But then if you select the whole thing, it's kind of also called like an element, a paragraph element. So yeah, we want to get an element by an ID, and then remember this is a function because you can see because we have these parentheses, which I again say if you don't know what that means, go ahead and check out the episode on functions. And we are passing in a string, if you remember, called text-input. And again, string is from the JavaScript for Beginners tutorial series. So text-input, we come look at our index.html. We see our input here. ID is text-input. So when we're calling this whole thing right here that I've highlighted up to this dot, we are basically getting this particular input. Because notice this one has an ID of date input and this one has an ID of submit button. So it's only getting this one with the text input ID. And then remember, a dot represents possession. So we're saying onchange. And what this means is we're saying when this element, when like what's inside it changes. So if I type again and I click off, it only registers the onchange when I click off. So type, click off, it says change, which is us printing change right here. So that's basically what we've done. We've said every time the input changes, run this function, which is pretty powerful because imagine we could say when this submit button is clicked, then go and log us in as the user. So we're gonna first actually be going over a little bit of the HTML part of this. So this is one way to create the onchange equals function e. But what we could also do is let's just take this date input and we can actually give it an onchange itself inside here. So we could say onchange equals, and then inside these parentheses is actually where we can write a tiny bit of JavaScript code. So we can say a date changed, and then we can call this. And notice this looks like a function call. It looks like we're calling a function here. And as you can see, I'm going to go ahead and change the date. Let's just make this year 2000, and I click off, or 0322. And notice it says date changed is not defined. And what that means is it's trying to call a function called date changed, but if you look in our JavaScript here, there is no function called date changed. So as you can probably guess, if we create a function called date changed and we pass it an e, we can console.log change date, just so we know the difference. So if I go ahead and start typing 00111 2000, boom, change date 4 times because every time I enter the year, technically the whole date changes. And notice there's that little bubble. There's a little 2 bubble, 3 bubble, 4 bubble. That's just how many times that same message has been printed. So that is pretty much in the HTML. You can add these attributes called onChanged, or if you have an input of type button, you can also add an onClick, and then we can set onClick equal to submit button clicked, for example. And then again, if we click this, it says submit button clicked not defined. So we create a function submit button clicked, and um, we console.log submit. And if we click on this, now it prints submit every time, and then we change the date, and then changes the date, submit again, change the text. So notice now we have a way to kind of register a change in every single one of our inputs. So that is kind of what JavaScript at least starts to do. So that was the HTML side. That was a little bit of this, although I will get into something else. Notice how all of these inputs have a class of inputs. Notice class equals inputs, class equals inputs, and class equals inputs. And if you don't remember, classes are attributes that we can give elements to essentially say they are in, or there are several of these types of elements. So I say class equals inputs, class equals inputs, class equals inputs. I'm saying there may be several inputs with this class. But if you notice the ID here, it's text input, date input, submit button. They're all different. They're all unique. There is only one element with this ID, but there may be multiple elements with this class. So same thing here. Remember how we did document.getElement by ID? Well, we can also do document.getElements by class name, like this. And then we can put inputs in here. And actually, let's go ahead and try to print this. So wrap the whole thing in a console.log and oops, save. So notice here in the console, it says HTML collection of 3, which means there are 3 things, which is input, input, input. And if we open this up, it's this input, text input, this input, date input, and this input, submit button. So in the same essence that if I printed this document.getElement by ID, just this part, .log, and then I put this in here, and remember we can comment things out by putting 2 slashes. It now just prints this input, text input, class equals input, type equals text, which is the document.getElement by ID text input. But remember, if we do this one, if we do get elements by class name, it gets us all 3 of our inputs. Just a little fun fact. And then, of course, I showed you on change and on click inside of our JavaScript. We can have like function date changed, submit button clicked, but we have on change here in the HTML. We have on click here in the HTML, but we can also refactor this. So we wanted to set the on change of our text input to this function. Well, we can just delete this whole thing here. And we could say function on text input changed, for example. And if we just come into here, we have to add an on change in here. We could just say on change equals text input. Right. Or we could just rename this text input changed. Call that function like that, and then just rename this text input changed. If we save this and we type something in, it says change down here. It says change with a little bubble on 2 and stuff like that. So we've just refactored this, aka refactor means we've rewritten it so that it looks like this, similar to these other 2. So I'll put these all next to each other because these all are very similar in the way they're written. Whoops. Yep. So in addition to just changing our text input, we can actually update the HTML. And what I mean by this is we can put, notice how we have an input here. We can add another P and give it and put nothing inside. So there's literally nothing. If I save this, notice it doesn't create anything. But we can give our P an ID of the result, for example. And what we can do is say on text input changed, remember this whole document.getElement by ID in here, text input? Well, we can copy this. And then instead of console.logging change, when we change our text input, like when we change what's inside this one, it prints change normally. Let's change it. Boom, prints change. I'm gonna comment this out so that it only prints change when I do that. And then I can actually remove that so it doesn't print change anymore. And I can paste in document.getElement by ID. And then instead of text-input, we want to be accessing this P right here with the ID of result. So we can say instead of text-input, we can put a string saying result. and then dot possession inner text is equal to hello. So if I change what's in here, look right here in the space between input and text, boom, it says hello now. And that's because as soon as this text input was changed, it ran document.getElement ById result, and result is this P right here that was initially empty. And then the inner text is what's inside the P. It's what's in between, which is currently empty, but we're actually setting it with JavaScript. We're giving it new inner text, which is pretty cool. And then in addition, what we could do is we could even do something like document.getElement ById, and then we could grab our text dash input, and then what we could say is dot value or dot get attribute value, if I'm not mistaken. Let me go ahead and test this. Actually, no. So yeah, if we want to set the inner text of this result into what is inside our element, well, this is actually another good exercise in just like learning how to code. Because if you are learning how to code, you will run into these issues all the time where you don't really actually know how to write this. So one thing that you can do is you can come over here to Google and then type in HT or JavaScript or yeah, JavaScript get input value. See right there. And then we just click on this first one right here. It's usually pretty good. All right. Okay, so I guess I did have it right. My autocomplete just wasn't working, apparently. Let's go ahead and test this. And we just go ahead and type value. And just value. No. Yep, and sometimes the autocomplete will be annoying. And if we save this, let's see what it does. So if we change this, boom. Oh, see, it actually works, and the autocomplete was not right. So this is my text, and then if we hit enter, or if we click off, it'll update it. This is my new text, and then I click off, boom. It keeps updating this. So that was pretty much how to, that's pretty much how you can actually update our HTML. We go document.getElement ById result.inner text, and then we set it equal to something new. And it doesn't have to be this dynamic value. It could be hello. And if we type something and do that, it types hello. Or let's do a quick little exercise, and this will mainly be for people who have watched the JavaScript for Beginners tutorial series. Let's create a variable called the text input, And what we want to do instead of doing this here is let's just go ahead and comment this out, and then set text input equal to document.getElement ById, and then go ahead and say text-input dot, and then we want to do the value like this. And what we're doing here is, notice when I change it now, it doesn't do anything. And that's because we are setting the value of this variable to what's inside the text input. And what we could do is when we actually click our submit button, we can call this code right here, document.getElement ById result.inner text is equal to, and then we could set it equal to the value of the variable. So notice we type in a bunch of stuff here, we hit enter, and only when we hit submit will it actually update the paragraph. So that's, this has probably been a lot. I would recommend going through the JavaScript for Beginners tutorial, at least the videos on variables, functions, and functions at the very least, and like maybe a little bit of objects to get the hold of what this dot kind of means in the code. And I think those three videos should be enough to kind of get a little bit of an understanding of what's going on in this file. So yeah, that has been the conclusion of inputs in our kind of like in HTML and JavaScript, and even in the previous video, notice we gave our inputs these little, let me zoom in, these little blue kind of borders, so that we actually made ourselves, because normally it's just a black line that goes around, which is pretty cool. So yeah, if you do want to see more videos in the series, or if you happen to miss a previous video, go ahead and check out the playlist linked in the description where I upload daily. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications whenever I post new videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.